Chapter 1. The truth is, you don't even realize the moment it starts going sideways. It doesn't start with yelling or disrespect or some dramatic blow-up. It starts earlier, quieter. It starts when you assume understanding instead of creating it. When you expect alignment without ever laying out the terms. When you're already reacting emotionally to behavior you never defined as unacceptable in the first place. That's the part nobody wants to look at, because it forces you to admit something uncomfortable. You weren't violated. You were unclear. You can feel it in your body the first time something happens that rubs you wrong. A look, a response, a situation where she handles herself in a way that doesn't sit right with you. Your chest tightens a little. Your thoughts speed up. You tell yourself it's not a big deal, that you don't want to be controlling, that you don't want to overreact. So you let it slide. But what you're really doing in that moment is postponing leadership. And postponed leadership doesn't disappear. It comes back as resentment later. Most men don't fail at relationships because they're weak or clueless. They fail because they expect harmony without structure. They expect someone to read their values, interpret their standards, and behave accordingly without ever being given a framework. And when that doesn't happen, they get mad at the result instead of questioning the process. They say things like, "She should know better," or "Any woman would know that's wrong." But that's not how people work. Everyone comes from a different environment, different norms, different tolerances. What feels obvious to you isn't universal. It's personal. You don't realize how much you're assuming until you hear yourself arguing later. You're explaining why something mattered to you after it already happened. You're retroactively drawing boundaries instead of establishing them. That puts you in a weak position immediately, not because your standard is wrong, but because it's late. And late standards always sound like control instead of clarity. Early standards sound like leadership. Timing changes everything. There's a difference between telling someone what to do and telling someone what you live by. One is dominance, the other is direction. Most men avoid direction because they are afraid of being misunderstood. They don't want to be labeled insecure, rigid, or old-fashioned, so they keep things loose, casual, undefined. They think flexibility will buy peace. What it actually buys is confusion. And confusion is where most relationship problems breed quietly before they ever surface. You see it when men complain about behavior in public settings. They say things like, "I can't believe she entertained that," or "Why would she even respond like that?" And when you ask the simple question, "Did you ever talk about how you expect her to move when you're together or when you're not around?" the answer is almost always no. Not because they didn't care, but because they assumed it was implied. Implied standards aren't standards. They're wishes. And wishes don't govern behavior. There's something deeply uncomfortable about sitting someone down and saying, "This is how I live, this is what I expect around me, and this is what doesn't work for me." It feels vulnerable because it reveals you. It shows what you care about. It exposes what bothers you. And most men were taught to hide that until there's a problem. But hiding standards doesn't protect you. It delays conflict and amplifies it when it finally arrives. Clarity early prevents explosions later. Think about how different it feels when rules are clear in any other area of life: work, sports, even friendships. When expectations are known, behavior adjusts naturally. People don't guess. They don't test as much. They know where the lines are, so they move comfortably within them. The same applies in relationships. Structure doesn't suffocate connection. It stabilizes it. It removes anxiety on both sides. The anxiety of guessing, the anxiety of misstepping, the anxiety of unspoken disappointment. What most men don't want to admit is that they often enjoy the early ambiguity. It feels exciting, open-ended, like anything is possible. But ambiguity is only fun when there's no investment yet. Once emotions deepen, ambiguity becomes a liability. You start needing predictability. You start wanting reliability. You start caring about how situations are handled because now they affect your peace. And if you didn't lay the groundwork earlier, you're left either swallowing discomfort or blowing up later. Neither option leads anywhere good. There's a story that plays out quietly in a lot of men's lives. They get into a relationship feeling optimistic. They don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to seem demanding, so they go with the flow. Months later, something happens that feels like a line crossed. They react strongly. She's confused because, from her perspective, nothing changed. She's been consistent with who she is. He's angry because, from his perspective, she violated an unspoken rule. That conflict isn't about disrespect. It's about misalignment that was never addressed when it was small enough to fix calmly. Leadership in a relationship isn't about control. It's about orientation. It's about saying, this is the environment I'm building my life in. This is how I move. This is what I'm comfortable with. This is what I'm not. And you're welcome here if this aligns with you. That's not oppressive. That's honest. It gives the other person agency. They can choose to adapt, or they can choose to opt out. What's unfair is expecting adaptation without disclosure. A lot of men get upset at repeat behavior without realizing something critical. The first time something happens and you never addressed it, that's on you. That's a missed opportunity to set tone. The second time it happens after you clearly addressed it, that's a choice. And choices tell you everything you need to know. But you can't skip the first step and jump straight to judgment. You can't hold someone accountable to rules they never heard. You don't need to be aggressive to be clear. You don't need to lecture. You don't need to dominate the conversation. You just need to be willing to say, this matters to me, and here's why. When you do that calmly, early, and consistently, something interesting happens. Respect either forms naturally or the relationship exposes its incompatibility quickly. Both outcomes save you time. Both outcomes protect your peace. What drains you is lingering in dynamics where nothing is defined but everything feels charged. If you're listening to this and realizing how often you've expected understanding instead of creating it, pause on that. That realization isn't an indictment. It's an upgrade. It means you're seeing the mechanics instead of just the emotion. And when you understand the mechanics, you stop taking things personally that were structural problems all along. You stop internalizing frustration and start correcting systems. This chapter isn't about blaming women. It's about recognizing your role as the architect of your environment. People behave differently in different structures. When you don't provide one, they default to their own. And their default may not match yours. That mismatch doesn't mean anyone is wrong. It means alignment was never established. Alignment doesn't happen by accident. It's built through clarity, repetition, and consistency. If this is starting to connect dots for you, go ahead and like the video. Not as agreement, but as acknowledgement that you've been assuming things you never actually communicated. In the next chapter, we'll talk about why most men confuse boundaries with control and how to set standards in a way that creates calm instead of conflict without turning the relationship into a power struggle. Chapter 2. What most men don't realize is that the moment they avoid setting standards because they're afraid of being controlling, they've already surrendered control of the environment, not to the woman, but to ambiguity. And ambiguity is ruthless. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care about your intentions. It just fills the vacuum you left. When nothing is defined, everything becomes negotiable. And when everything is negotiable, you end up reacting instead of leading. You can feel the difference between boundaries and control in your own body if you're honest about it. Control feels tense. It feels like gripping something too tightly because you're afraid it will slip away. Boundaries feel calm. They feel like standing in place and letting the world decide whether it wants to move with you or not. The confusion comes from men who never learned to distinguish between the two. They were taught that asserting needs equals insecurity, that standards equal rigidity, that leadership equals dominance. So they stay silent, hoping good intentions will do the work clarity was supposed to do. Silence doesn't create peace, it delays friction. And delayed friction always shows up louder than necessary. You see it when men suddenly explode over something that seems small to everyone else. They snap over a comment, a situation, a behavior that's been happening for months. From the outside, it looks irrational. From the inside, it's accumulated resentment finally finding an outlet. That resentment didn't come from one moment. It came from dozens of moments where something bothered you and you said nothing because you didn't want to seem like the bad guy. There's a subtle dishonesty in that silence that most men don't want to admit. When you don't say what matters to you early, you're not being kind. You're being strategic in a way that backfires. You're presenting a version of yourself that's more flexible than you actually are, hoping the other person will naturally conform later. That's not leadership. That's bait and wait. And when the conformity doesn't happen, you feel betrayed by an expectation you never expressed. Boundaries, when set correctly, don't feel like rules imposed on someone else. They feel like information about how you operate. You're not saying you must do this. You're saying, this is what works around me. There's a big difference. One invites resistance, the other invites alignment. People don't push back against clarity nearly as much as they push back against surprise. Surprise boundaries feel punitive. Clear boundaries feel fair. Think about how much tension disappears when expectations are named early. Not dramatically, not aggressively, just matter of fact. When you say how you expect situations to be handled, what behavior feels respectful to you, what crosses a line for you, you remove guesswork. Guesswork is what creates anxiety on both sides. She's wondering what will upset you. You're wondering whether something will happen again. Neither of you feels settled because the rules of the environment are invisible. Making them visible calms everyone down. A lot of men confuse leadership with micromanagement because they've never seen leadership done quietly. Real leadership isn't loud. It doesn't repeat itself constantly. It sets tone once and reinforces it through consistency. You don't need to revisit every issue if the structure is sound. You don't need to argue every time something happens. You observe, you correct when necessary, and you move forward. The repetition is in your behavior, not in your speeches. This is where timing matters more than tone. The same standard communicated early feels protective. Communicated late, it feels restrictive. The words might be identical, but the context changes how they land. That's why men who wait until they're already upset struggle to be heard. They're not wrong, but they're late. And lateness turns clarity into conflict. The earlier you define the environment, the less emotion is required to maintain it. There's a kind of respect that forms when someone realizes you're consistent about what you accept and what you don't. Not because you punish, but because you don't waver. You don't say one thing and tolerate another. You don't complain about behavior you keep allowing. That alignment between your words and your actions builds credibility fast. People trust what you say because they've seen you stand on it calmly without theatrics. You might be thinking that this sounds exhausting, like you're supposed to constantly manage someone else's behavior. It's actually the opposite. Clear standards reduce management. When expectations are known, most people self-correct. They don't need reminders. They don't need monitoring. They adjust because they understand the environment they're in. The chaos comes from environments where nothing is defined and everything is emotional. That's when every situation turns into a negotiation instead of a decision. There's a single story that illustrates this better than any theory. Think about a time when you entered a new space where the rules were clear from the beginning. A job, a team, a situation where expectations were laid out cleanly. You didn't feel oppressed. You felt oriented. You knew how to succeed. You knew what not to do. Compare that to environments where nothing is clear and everyone is guessing. Stress goes up. Conflict increases. People take things personally because structure is missing. Relationships work the same way, even though we pretend they shouldn't. Most men don't want to be the one to define things because they are afraid of rejection. They think if I say what I need, she might leave. That fear reveals something important. You're more afraid of losing her than you are of losing yourself. And that imbalance shows up eventually, whether you acknowledge it or not. When you lead with clarity, you accept the possibility of incompatibility early. That's not failure, that's efficiency. It saves you from months or years of friction with someone who was never aligned to begin with. There's also a deeper confidence that grows when you stop negotiating your standards internally. You stop asking yourself, am I tripping? Am I doing too much? Should I just let it go? You already know where you stand. That certainty reduces emotional noise. You're not constantly checking your reactions against imagined expectations. You're responding from a place of settled values. That steadiness is felt, and it changes how people interact with you over time. You don't need to dominate conversations to lead them. You don't need to assert yourself constantly. You just need to be clear once and consistent always. Consistency is what makes boundaries real. Without it, they're just suggestions. With it, they become part of the environment. And people either respect environments they understand or they remove themselves from them. Both outcomes are acceptable. What's not acceptable is living in constant frustration because you never define the space you're in. If this chapter is helping you see why avoiding standards actually creates more conflict, pause and like the video. Not because it feels good, but because it reframes something you've probably been struggling with silently. In the next chapter, we'll talk about how to communicate expectations without turning the relationship into a power struggle, and why calm repetition beats emotional confrontation every time when it comes to building respect and stability. Chapter 3. There's a way to communicate expectations that doesn't turn into a standoff, and it starts with something most men skip entirely. Calm repetition without emotion. Not explaining yourself 10 different ways. Not justifying your standard. Not escalating your tone to be taken seriously. Just stating what matters to you, then living in alignment with it long enough that the other person realizes it's not a negotiation. That's where respect forms quietly, not in the moment of the conversation, but in the consistency that follows it. Most men think communication fails because they didn't say enough, when in reality it fails because they said too much, too emotionally, too late. They wait until frustration builds, then dump everything at once. The message might be valid, but it's drowned in tone. The other person doesn't hear the standard. They hear anger, disappointment, accusation, and once that happens, the dynamic shifts from cooperation to defense. Now it's no longer about alignment. It's about who's right, who's wrong, who feels attacked, who needs to be validated. The original point gets lost immediately. Calm communication feels almost anticlimactic, especially if you're used to intensity being the only way things change. You say something once, clearly, without heat, and part of you wonders if it even landed. You don't see an immediate reaction. There's no argument, no dramatic response. Just a nod, maybe a short acknowledgement, and your mind starts racing. Did she take me seriously? Did I say it right? Should I explain more? That urge to keep talking is where most men undo themselves. They chase certainty through words instead of through behavior. What actually makes expectations stick is what happens after the conversation, not during it. If you say something matters to you, and then you tolerate the opposite, you've taught the environment that your words don't carry weight. Not because you're weak, but because behavior is louder than explanation. Every time you let something slide after saying it's not okay, you retrain the dynamic. You turn a boundary into a suggestion. And suggestions invite testing. People don't test boundaries that are consistently enforced without drama. They test ones that wobble. There's a rhythm to this that takes patience. You state your expectation early, before emotion is involved. You don't overframe it. You don't moralize it. You don't make it about her character. You make it about your environment. This works for me. This doesn't. Then you move on. You don't hover. You don't monitor. You don't wait anxiously for a mistake so you can react. You live normally. And if the behavior aligns, great. If it doesn't, your response is proportional and immediate, not explosive, just adjusted. This is where men get uncomfortable because it requires restraint. It requires you to not chase understanding, to not demand agreement, to not seek emotional reassurance that you were heard. You trust the process instead of the moment. You trust that consistency will communicate more clearly than intensity ever could. That trust is hard to build if you're used to equating emotional release with resolution. Calm feels like nothing is happening when in reality, everything is being set in motion underneath. Think about how power struggles actually start. They don't start when someone sets a standard. They start when someone tries to enforce a standard inconsistently. One day it matters, the next day it doesn't. One moment it's a big deal. The next it's brushed off. That inconsistency forces the other person into a guessing game. They don't know which version of you they're dealing with, so they push to find the edges. That push isn't always conscious. It's a response to uncertainty. Clear, consistent behavior removes the need for that push entirely. There's a particular confidence that shows up when you stop trying to control outcomes and focus on controlling your own responses. You're not trying to make someone behave a certain way. You're deciding how you behave in response to what they choose. That shift changes everything. You're no longer in a tug of war, you're standing still. If someone moves toward alignment, they're welcomed. If they move away, you don't chase. That stillness is what makes your standards feel solid instead of oppressive. Most men fear that if they don't explain themselves enough, they'll be misunderstood. What they don't realize is that over-explaining is often what creates misunderstanding. It opens too many doors. It invites debate. It turns a personal standard into a topic. Standards aren't topics, they're positions. You don't argue your position, you hold it. People are free to agree or disagree, but the position doesn't change based on their feelings about it. This is where repetition comes in, not verbal repetition, but behavioral repetition. You show, again and again, what you accept and what you don't by how you respond. You don't need to remind. You don't need to threaten. You don't need to escalate. You adjust access, time, energy. You stay polite. You stay calm. And you let the pattern teach the lesson. Patterns are what people respond to long-term, not speeches. There's a story that illustrates this better than any theory. A man enters a relationship wanting harmony. Early on, something small happens that doesn't sit right with him. He says nothing. It happens again. Still nothing. Months later, he finally brings it up, frustrated. The conversation is heated. Promises are made. Things change briefly, then revert. He feels disrespected. From her perspective, the rule appeared suddenly, fully formed, after months of tolerance. Now imagine the same situation handled differently. The first time it happens, he mentions it calmly. No accusation, just information. This doesn't work for me. She adjusts, or she doesn't. Either way, the tone is set early. There's no explosion later because the structure was built before emotion accumulated. Same standard, completely different outcome. What keeps men stuck is the belief that being firm will make them unlikable. But likability built on self-erasure doesn't last. It creates quiet resentment, and resentment leaks out eventually, no matter how hard you try to suppress it. Being clear early may cost you some connections. Being unclear costs you peace. One loss is immediate, the other is slow and corrosive. Choose which one you can live with. There's also something freeing about accepting that not everyone will align with you. When you stop trying to be universally acceptable, you gain the ability to be deeply compatible with the right people. Compatibility doesn't come from flexibility without limits. It comes from clarity that allows the right match to recognize itself. When you define your environment, you give people a chance to opt in honestly instead of drifting in under false assumptions. This approach also changes how you hear feedback. When someone pushes back against a standard you've stated calmly and early, you don't take it as a personal attack. You see it as information. This doesn't align with how they want to live. That information is valuable. It saves you time. It prevents future conflict. You're not offended by incompatibility. You're relieved by its early discovery. You'll notice that when you communicate this way, fewer things require discussion at all. The dynamic becomes smoother, less reactive, less charged. You're not constantly renegotiating the same issues because the structure is already in place. When something new comes up, it's handled in context, not as part of a long list of unresolved frustrations. That cleanliness is what most people mean when they say they want peace in a relationship. Peace doesn't come from silence. It comes from clarity maintained over time. If you're listening and realizing how often you waited until you were upset to speak, how often you tried to explain instead of demonstrate, sit with that. That awareness isn't about regret. It's about adjustment. You don't need to overhaul who you are. You just need to shift when and how you communicate what matters to you. Early, calmly, consistently. If this chapter is helping you see why communication fails less from what you say and more from how you live afterward, like the video, not as validation, but as a marker that you're starting to understand structure instead of just emotion. In the next chapter, we'll talk about what happens when standards are clear but ignored, how to respond without anger or ultimatums, and why walking away calmly is sometimes the strongest form of leadership there is. Chapter 4. There comes a moment when you've been clear, you've been consistent, you've been calm, and the behavior still doesn't change. That's the moment most men dread, because it removes every excuse they've been leaning on. You can't say she didn't know. You can't say you never talked about it. You can't say it was a misunderstanding. The information was given. The structure was visible. The pattern continued anyway. And now, the question isn't about communication anymore. It's about choice. This is where leadership stops being theoretical and becomes personal. Not dramatic, not loud, personal. Because now the only thing left for you to do is decide what you tolerate when you're no longer confused. Anger feels tempting here. Ultimatums feel powerful. Long explanations feel justified. But none of those are necessary. They don't add clarity. They add noise. The strongest response at this stage is the quietest one. You adjust your presence. You reduce access. You move differently. You let behavior meet consequence without announcement. Most men think walking away calmly is weakness, because they have been taught that strength has to be confrontational, that if you don't argue, you didn't care, that if you don't fight, you lost. But calm departure is the opposite of weakness. It's evidence that you trust your own standards enough not to beg for compliance. You're not trying to change someone who has already shown you what they're choosing. You're respecting their choice and honoring yours at the same time. This is also where many men realize they were secretly hoping clarity would magically transform someone, that if they explained it the right way, at the right time, things would click. That hope keeps them stuck longer than anything else. Hope isn't bad, but misplaced hope is expensive. It costs time. It costs energy. It costs self-respect. When someone ignores a clearly stated standard, they're not confused. They're prioritizing something else. And that information is more valuable than any promise they could make in response to pressure. You can feel the difference in your body when you stop arguing with reality. There's a release. Not relief exactly, but steadiness. You stop rehearsing conversations in your head. You stop waiting for the next incident. You stop bracing. That constant low-level tension disappears because you're no longer trying to hold a structure together alone. Structures only work when both people respect them. When that respect isn't there, the structure collapses no matter how carefully you built it. Walking away doesn't have to look like abandonment. It can be as simple as disengaging emotionally, responding less, initiating less, investing less. You don't owe a speech. You don't owe closure. You already provided clarity. Closure is something people seek when they want reassurance, not when they've accepted truth. Acceptance doesn't need explanation. It needs action. And action speaks clearly without saying a word. There's a fear that lingers for a lot of men at this point. The fear of being alone, the fear of starting over, the fear that maybe this was the best you could do. That fear is loudest when you've been in a dynamic that gave you familiarity without alignment. Familiarity is comfortable even when it's wrong. Alignment feels uncertain because it requires patience. But patience in alignment pays dividends. Familiarity without respect drains you slowly until you don't recognize yourself anymore. When you choose to walk away calmly, something important happens internally. You prove to yourself that your standards aren't conditional on someone else's approval. That proof builds confidence faster than any argument ever could. You start trusting your judgment because you've acted on it. You stop wondering whether you're overreacting because your reactions are no longer emotional. They're principled. That shift changes how you approach every relationship that comes after this one. People often ask how to tell when it's time to leave without dramatizing it. The answer is simple but uncomfortable. It's when you feel like you're repeating yourself internally more than externally. When you're constantly reminding yourself why something should be okay instead of feeling okay about it. When you're doing more internal work to maintain peace than the situation itself requires. That's your signal. Not a betrayal. Not a blow-up. A pattern that doesn't move. This is also where respect shows up in an unexpected way. Not from the person you're leaving, but from yourself and from others who observe how you move. People notice when you don't chase. They notice when you don't collapse. They notice when you leave without trashing anyone, without playing the victim, without turning it into a spectacle. That restraint communicates maturity. It communicates confidence. It communicates that your standards are real because you're willing to lose access to protect them. Over time, this changes the kind of people who enter your life. You attract those who listen the first time, those who adjust without resentment, those who see standards as structure, not threat. You stop dealing with constant friction because you filtered it out early. And when issues do arise, they're handled cleanly because the foundation is solid. You're no longer trying to fix people. You're choosing environments that work. There's a quiet satisfaction in knowing that you didn't abandon your values to keep a connection. That satisfaction isn't loud. It doesn't feel like a win in the moment. It feels like integrity. And integrity compounds. It affects how you walk into rooms, how you speak, how you decide. You become someone who doesn't need to convince others because you're already convinced of yourself. That's what leadership looks like when it's fully internalized. If you think back to the beginning of this video, to that first moment of discomfort when something didn't sit right and you ignored it, you can see how small the turning point actually was. Leadership isn't one big act. It's a series of small decisions made early. Speak now or swallow it, clarify now or clean it up later, act now or resent it later. Every time you choose clarity early, you reduce the need for force later. Every time you avoid it, you borrow conflict from the future. As this final chapter settles, understand this without turning it into a rulebook. You don't need to control anyone. You don't need to program another human being like a machine. You need to define the environment you're willing to live in and move accordingly. People will either meet you there or they won't. Your job isn't to convince them. It's to stay consistent with what you said matters to you. If this entire video has helped you see where frustration actually comes from, not from disrespect, but from undefined structure, take a second and like it. Not as agreement with everything said, but as recognition that leadership begins earlier than most men realize. Share it with someone who keeps getting mad about things they never addressed. And as you move forward, remember this quietly. Clarity early is kindness, consistency is respect, and walking away without anger is often the strongest statement you'll ever make.